This painting symbolizes a country's foundation. A quiet room, clean signatures, steady resolve, total unity, promises of liberty. This is the signing of the United States Constitution. But from where I stood, promises were already being broken, and a debt was owed.
Hi esteemed logicians, welcome to the Logical Christ channel. The Logical Christ will react to Road to Liberty, Articles of Confederation video based on biblical standards. Sit back and relax. We will be back after this short intro.
Thinking with Logical Christ.
This clause, here, must be revised.
They started drafting it in '76.
Let us agree to this historic measure.
Congress approved it in '77, then began signing in '78, but it didn't officially go into effect until '81.
I reflect that early governance structures reveal human limitation and the need for divine wisdom in nation building. Christians understand that political systems without righteousness become unstable and fragile. The scriptures in Proverbs 29:2 say, "When the righteous rule, the people rejoice." Christians recognize that delayed formation of governing frameworks shows how human plans require God's guidance for stability. Psalm 127:1 says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain." This truth applies to nations as well. I understand that weak foundations in governance remind believers that authority must be grounded in God's justice. Romans 13:1 teaches that all governing authorities are established under God. Micah 6:8 further calls for justice, mercy, and humility in leadership.
It is finished.
And for a moment, we felt we might have a nation. But even as it was being written, the weakness was already there.
I perceive that fragile beginnings of governance reflect human imperfection and the need for divine order in society. Christians see that instability highlights dependence on God rather than political strength alone. Isaiah 33:22 says, "The Lord is our judge, lawgiver, and king." Christians understand that weak systems reveal the necessity of spiritual grounding in leadership. Psalm 46:1 says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." This assures believers that divine support sustains nations in uncertainty. I reflect that political fragility emphasizes the importance of wisdom and collective counsel under God. Proverbs 11:14 says, "Where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in abundance of counselors there is safety." This applies to national leadership structures.
At Trenton, we marched, broke, pay missing, terms expiring, bellies empty.
I propose that this resolution be adopted.
Congress could pass resolutions, but it couldn't collect a single dollar to back them.
I understand that extreme hardship among soldiers exposes injustice when societies fail to honor labor and sacrifice. Christians believe fairness in compensation reflects God's justice. Deuteronomy 24:15 says, "Give him his wages each day before sunset." Christians recognize that suffering during conflict reveals human dependence on justice and compassion. James 2:16 says, "If a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, and one says go in peace, it is meaningless." I reflect that neglect of soldiers shows failure of stewardship within leadership systems. Matthew 25:35 says, "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink."
So we crossed on promises, not pay. Then, Valley Forge. Winter didn't just test our commitment, it exposed a weakness. No proper clothes, not enough bread, and the army froze while waiting for Congress to act. The Articles were built from fear.
We must grant Congress the power to tax, General.
Absolutely not.
Fear that a strong government would grow into a new tyrant, so they kept the strength with the states. Congress tried to cobble together a semblance of
I
government.
perceive that lack of central taxation power demonstrates weakness in governance and responsibility. Christians understand that orderly civic contribution is part of God's design for society. Romans 13:7 says, Give to everyone what you owe them. Christians recognize that failure to support soldiers shows poor stewardship of communal resources. Psalm 37:25 says, I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging for bread. I reflect that fear of strong central authority shows tension between liberty and order in governance. Isaiah 33:22 says, The Lord is our lawgiver and king. He will save us and guide righteousness.
But they couldn't even pay their own debts. We'd beaten Britain at Yorktown, yet still we shivered like we'd lost. The fighting ceased. The bill came due. Congress pleaded. States hesitated.
Payment isn't coming. We're being called to confer in private.
I understand that military victory without stable governance leads to continued suffering and instability. Christians see that success without righteousness becomes incomplete. Proverbs 14:12 says, There is a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to death. Christians recognize that failure to pay debts and support soldiers reflect injustice and broken stewardship. James 5:4 says, The wages you fail to pay the workers are crying out against you. I reflect that justice and compensation is essential for moral order. Luke 10:7 says, The worker deserves his wages. This affirms dignity and fairness in community responsibility.
And the army, my men, who bled for freedom discovered that gratitude alone doesn't feed your family. Washington didn't write the Articles, but he lived with their consequences.
Gentlemen, the decisions we make now will determine our future.
We did not bleed for this nation only to be cast aside when it is convenient.
That winter, the talk turned dangerous. If Congress wouldn't act, maybe the army must. We'd collect the debts by force.
We must march on Congress to secure our dues.
I perceive that rising frustration among soldiers reveals consequences of injustice and failed leadership. Christians understand that oppression leads to suffering and instability. Ecclesiastes 4:1 says, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and no comforter. Christians recognize that temptation toward violence arises when justice is denied, yet believers are called to restraint. Romans 12:19 says, Do not take revenge. Leave room for God's wrath. I reflect that absence of vision and justice leads to societal breakdown. Proverbs 29:18 says, Where there is no revelation, people cast off restraint.
An attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety. How unmilitary.
I expected him to punish us, charge us with treason. Instead, he spoke with the steady resolve of a man who had seen and overcome greater hardships.
Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles. For I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country.
I perceive that calm leadership during crisis demonstrates humility and wisdom aligned with biblical principles. Christians are called to humility in all leadership roles. Philippians 2:3 says, In humility value others above yourselves. Christians recognize that servant leadership reflects Christ's example of humility and restraint. Matthew 23:11 says, The greatest among you will be your servant. I reflect that wise intervention restores unity in times of division. 1 Samuel 16:7 says, The Lord looks at the heart, not outward appearance.
That was all we needed to hear, and suddenly our fury felt small. And then he did the unthinkable, what victorious commanders almost never do.
Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action.
He humbly handed back power. He retired at the end of the war to return to his farm. In that moment, I realized an army could seize anything except legitimacy.
I understand that voluntary surrender of power reflects rare moral courage and humility. Christians see this as aligned with surrendering personal ambition for higher purpose. Acts 20:24 says, My life is worth nothing unless I finish my race. Christians recognize that humility, in authority, reflects Christ's example of service and sacrifice. Luke 14:11 says, "Those who humble themselves will be exalted." I reflect that relinquishing power after success establishes legitimacy and moral integrity. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall."
We'd beaten a tyrant. Now we had to decide what or who could replace him without becoming him. Because the next fight wasn't on a battlefield. It was over the kind of country we'd become.
I perceive that true legitimacy of governance depends on righteousness rather than military strength. Christians understand that earthly authority is temporary under God's eternal rule. Psalm 145:13 says, "Your kingdom endures forever." Christians recognize that political systems must be guided by moral account, ability and divine truth. John 18:36 says, "My kingdom is not of this world." I reflect that preventing tyranny requires justice, humility, and obedience to God's commands. Micah 6:8 says, "Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." I hope you learned from this video. Comment down below for your thoughts on this logical reactions to Road to Liberty. Articles of Confederation video based on biblical standards. You may please subscribe and hit the like button to stay tuned for another Bible-based reactions. Until next time.
Thinking with Logical Christ.